Hello everyone, today we talk about the Livian version on the foundation of Rome. We could have made an Ab Urbe Condita first book read, not the entire first book, but at least the beginning, with the foundation of Rome. Today's video is instead rather like a general discussion about Livy, his relation with, say, the quite burdensome, let's say, task that he admits himself having undertaken of writing this history of the Romans, and the role that these had of course in the world, where the author reflects on the contemporary events of his. Livy is a pessimist to some degree, hence the part of rationale and sort of realism of his approach we will in part see today, mostly because of the civil wars. He is, as you know, living fundamentally at he's a basically contemporary of Octavian Augustus, and he still embodies like that type of free citizenship that is able, in spite of the critical events of the civil wars, to, in fact, take a look at the history of Rome as a whole, as a conscious Roman, and expressing his vision of the same. Naturally, there would be plenty of stuff to say. We could make a series about Livy, his background, the relation, in fact, with the Augustan policy and propaganda, etc. But definitely there is something more personal that the author lets shine through regarding at least the approach to modern times compared, in fact, to the ones of the origins. And I think that this is a bit the leitmotif of this video, that we'll read bits and pieces of the entire text that, again, you can easily find if you go on Perseus or whichever site with all the various versions, either in, say, of course, the Latin one, but also the various translation if you can't read in the original language. And you can read better than I can simply tell you, like if you want me to be just like your bedtime voice, listening about how Romans raped, killed, and etc. Well, that could be interesting. But of course, there is a deeper meaning in this whole, right? As you know, we are pretty much into the traditional meaning of history in general, not just Rome, but of course the latter owns a primal role that the same Livy envisages, not just because he's a Roman, by the way. Just think about what Polybius thought. Yes, he was a Romanophile to some degree. But there is definitely something that Rome had achieved at that point, even after the crisis, the Civil War, and especially so with the restoration of the Golden Era from the Saturnia Tellus and so on. So the idea of the foundation of Rome here weighs a lot, because it is, in fact, as not just as how it all began, but how it had to come back, right, to be, which naturally from such a metaphysical distance from the events, because yes, the Ab Urbe Condita is, as you know, from temporally from 753, the Baronian, but let's say the sense is that here there is a moral dimension that Livy intends, of course, to cover. And what is beautiful, if I'm not wrong, in the third paragraph, today we will not read it, but he says explicitly that the actual point of this history, this touches me personally as a historian, is, and I can't agree more, with the actual political issues and the military actions, the decisions behind this connection. It's very Clausewitzian in nature. We already pointed out how other contemporaries like Caesar had literally, nailed the Clausewitzian Trinity in the, actually, von Clausewitz come later, and I'm not entirely sure that he was aware of this, but that sort of, it's not just a tripartite in the European order, but the sense that properly the self-sacrifice in holy combat is the key to the entire dominion of the world, not just of yourself. And in fact, in the same foundation of Rome, we will see lots of these aspects. If anything, the entire story is framed within that as well. That's something I wanted to point out just by rereading the passages today with this mood, right? So there is the premise, right, concerning the events that are told. I'm paraphrasing here to have not paraphrasing, actually translating, but let's say also explaining some words and highlighting certain semantics here that are told having happened much before the foundation of Rome, or when this was about to happen. They appear more embellished by sort of poetical tales, we can say, than supported by uncorrupted historical documents, right? But, and in this sense, Livy says, it's not my intention nor to confirm, nor to essentially debunk them, right? To refute them. And this attitude is fantastic because, as you know, if you have studied Roman history, philology, religion, or whatever, Livy is key to the earliest, phases of Roman history. And in this sense, much of what basically these sagas that unfortunately we do not know. I mean, Livy had them, knew them, etc. And he would understand them to a degree that we can't, but he also, in fact, didn't have yet the historical philological means that we have to sort of necessarily appreciate the plenitude of that technicality that at least we are fixated with nowadays. Is not judging what, in fact, he understood to be meaningfully loaded stories, right? There are beautiful pages written by great authors like Georges Dumézil, in the European interpretation, of course, of the foundation of Rome. We made multiple videos about that, and we'll keep hopefully making them. And you realize that in these Roman sagas, every single word, every single aspect, let's say detail, etc., is an incredibly intricate set of meaning, right? And to a degree that here the first century BC Roman historian would in fact understand, given his background, his sensitivity, his even just say the language that they spoke and the way they would interpret, this would evoke certain ideas, certain imagery, certain beliefs, and emotions even that we can't quite read in the same way, and that are for that very reason presented to an audience that is not really our own, right? It would require all this pretty solid background in lots of aspects, including, of course, the original language, etc., that here we can't quite simply address, at least in a single video, because I will try to keep it short, right? But this is a topic that requires a monstrously long introduction. In any case, we will hopefully see some of this at some other point, because again, today's video doesn't have any ambition to be who knows what, just highlighting certain examples. And Livy goes on and says, this is a concession that we make to the past times, right? Blending divine and human stories to render more authoritative the beginnings of the city. And this is a very, if you want, modern secular way of seeing, but and this is the point, however, that he sort of because he's always swinging between these things. He's admitting that he is approaching the thing in a sort of rational sense, in a sort of critical sense, and he's aware that some of these stories are, at least in the way they were handed down, that were sort of altered in a way that were purposeful, right? Because at the end of the day, these people were just human, and it's a bit like, in other religions, think about the Bible. What's the relation between the Word of God and the actual one written down as the Bible, as the book, right? This is another story, but this is the point that Livy makes, that could have not gone otherwise without the actual divine accomplishment of Rome, and so a connection with the past that he points out. He says, if thus a nation exists of which we have to grant, to deem their origins to be sacred, to be holy, and to refer them to in front, and referring to them and telling to them in front of the same God, so like he would also do as a historian, because Livy was like still a rigorously, we imagine a rigorously religious Roman, like it was normal at the time, and so he would have hardly any of the attitude we have today towards the religion, and it allows him in fact to discuss this with this awareness that the divine does exist, right, and the humans may have altered the story. That's what it says, such is the military glory of the Roman people, that when he boasts Mars as his father, and has his father his founder, etc., and he that this is worth accepting as such. There is a very interesting aspect, by the way, in the association with, of course, the Romulan foundation and the martial descendancy, right? And we have to appreciate, in fact, here that Mars in the Roman religion, in the most archaic one, right? So in the archaic triad that was made up by Jupiter, Mars, in fact, and Quirinus, is very close to the proper Indo-European ideal. We have actually commented on the Capitoline triad also later on in imperial times, and as you know, there are other two gods aside from Jupiter, goddesses actually, but that's something that doesn't touch us on today specifically. You realize that there is in Mars not quite the Hellenic Ares, right? There is not the sort of disappointing son of the gods that always gets defeated by his sister Athena, right? And it's, again, important that the Romans would adopt as later Capitoline triad Jupiter, Minerva, and so the equivalent of Athena, and Juno as essentially the latter, the chthonic, maternal, subjugated, obedient element, right, by the godfather and so on. So the concept instead of Mars in the Roman religion was much more heroic, was much more Tyr-like, right, just to make that example. So that Quirinus, in this connection, so the Quirites, the Romans themselves, descended from this as the same son of Jupiter, and therefore, making the Romans, as a consequence, a Jovelian, right, race. And this is also exemplified, and we will talk about the Iuli, right, that Livy addresses, in fact, also as far as their Venus descendancy were concerned. We're not just descendants of Mars, right? You say, but so this, after all, they picked Mars and Venus and maybe not other gods, but you have to keep, of course, track of the genealogy there, that Mars, of course, was the son of Jupiter, and Juno, there are various versions, etc., but the descendancy from Jupiter is univocal, right? All the times that I relentlessly repeat that, of course, only one god existed and the rest was just a fruit of the decadence of the world, and people still think that polytheism as such existed. Well, it's your problem, right? I had my path in history of religions. I don't have to convince you forcefully, but if you don't enter that mindset, you can't go anywhere. In fact, given that Livy, as we will see now, introduces instead the the Trojan descendancy from of the Romans, right, which was an Hellenic gift by this point. You have to consider that if you go back in time, Aeneas and Chises, and you look at all the ancestors, the last one is actually Zeus, right? That, as you know, in the etymology, it's the same etymology of Deus, of Jupiter, right? So it's all in the Indo-European languages, the single god, and the way it's say we can't stop every time Livy says something wondering what he actually knew or what he didn't, or how much he rationalized and just wrote for the sake of it, but the sake of a historical literary work. But of course, it seems to me that he was quite aware of much of this side issues, and that he was following, as he actually expresses at the beginning, some specific stylistic canons that had in a historian's work that is aware. He admittedly declares was also a matter of literally competing with all those who had written before, and he says, but something quite interesting says, how much can, every historian, everyone who writes something about the stories always thinks that the stories that are known by lots of people, that he will be his version will be read more than the others by the posterity because it's sort of written better, right? He literally makes this point, and of course, you understand in Livy a Roman culture that has highly developed also in a literary sense, was influenced by the Hellenic culture and so on. Even though Livy, of course, is you immediately understand the radical difference that is pretty staunch between Hellenic and Latin culture, Romano-Italic culture as a whole, because the latter is much more morally oriented, right? All these issues have to do with the fact that the actual choices that we were telling you before, how this great leaders and commanders came to make Rome the one it was, right? And that Livy says by his point in history was always becoming burdened by her own greatness, right? So again, Livy is not an optimistic guy. He thinks, and this is something recurrent in Roman early imperial, also Roman literature. Tacitus says the same thing, that of course there is eventually a decline, right? And this sort of darker view is actually reminiscent in that ancestral attitude also towards Mars, the son of Jupiter. So much more of the Norse, the Germanic tradition, the sort of darker background of which the Romans came from, and that we assume, at least in pop culture, was some sort of variation of a Greek culture by this point, but they emerged pretty rapidly, by the way, from an incredibly brutal and radically and traumatically violent tribal background that we have explained in many videos, especially in fact in the Roman conquest of Italy, and that we observed also in the properly in the empire that had extended this point across the entire Mediterranean and also in continental Europe. And so the say what the Romans say is done with an enormously greater specific weight, semantically speaking, especially than you would imagine. If you read Tacitus, you realize that senatorial background really made him at that point in history see the world in much more metaphysical terms, that it's something you don't imagine from the classicistic, illuministic kind of distortion that was done in the 18th century, in fact, of Roman identity and culture. It has barely anything to do with the truest spirit of the universal empire, right? And for obvious reasons, because those who wrote in that century were not really those who were some of the peoples that abandoned the universalistic commitment and contributed to immorally disgregate, in fact, the order of the universal authority in the modern age. So there is a lot to tell regarding, in fact, mostly our own problems and we should be able to read authors like Livy as well with a bit more of, care, right, attention, because what they say is not that immediately sort of understandable from our own background. There is a lot of unsaid stuff that, however, to a Roman of the time would have sounded very refined, even if Livy was sort of less traditionalistic to some extent than other authors, or at least than some actual beliefs, including the ones of the sources he was drawing from, and that, as always, if we have this tragedy in ancient history, we do not know practically anything. And that's probably one of the single most painful things in the world, right? Worse than wars or other tragedies, whatever. These are some of the single greatest tragedies in the entire history of mankind, right? And the degree of ignorance of people that are concerned just with their personal lives is the actual reason why their lives are so miserable in the first place. Now, when we read Livy's great prose and history in the Augustan era, we immediately approach his critical geist, right? His intention to sort of be wary of the poetical arrangements that have been made of certain stories in the way they were reporting at least what had happened about the origin. But this is exactly why he says quite clearly that he doesn't want to refute them, right? That the way this has been expressed doesn't have essentially to alter our, let's say, openness, our willingness to understand the deepest meaning behind the mere word, right? Even though words were meant, yes, to be magical to some extent still at the time, but again, in an importantly secularized and modernized society for ancient standards at this point. And so these tales are reported by Livy as he is aware that they are expression of the mentality of archaic times. That is mandatory in order to connect oneself with not just what really happened, but for Livy and for the ecumenic nature of Roman destiny, not to lose the same Roman identity, especially at that point in history, that is, after the tormented and bloody passage, say, from the what had been seen as the degenerate order, right, the one in which Senate lost control, in which the monarchic regime was deemed fit, given the imperial weight, right, of those who had, or he better had managed to put things together. We talked a lot about the Jovian theology connected with Augustan times, and we'll keep coming back on that because it's a never-ending story. It's like unveiling, like this is truly the iceberg of Roman history, not the one that you see mimified on YouTube, etc. So Livy widens the same traditional story, and he inserts within it, as we were saying before, this other, say, traditional story, but not to the Romans in this case, of the arrival of Aeneas in Latium, right? This had been a legacy of the ancient Hellenic culture through, say, the Roman literary development via the Magna Graecia since the late 3rd century, the First Punic War. And this is still crucial because in the ancient world, the most important cultural point of reference was the Trojan cycle, right? The myth of the great Troy, but also those who brought her down, Achilles, and all the glory that shrouded the entire the entire characters, was the same source of inspiration of Alexander the Great, that the same Augustus was following in his footsteps. There are beautiful passages, about Augustus' life, describing when he reached, for example, Alexander, and he thought that Alexander was alive. Right, this was Augustus' belief. This is what the Romans thought of the universal, ecumenic, again, absoluteness of the empire and of eternal life and eternal glory, right? Eternal imperium. They were truly convinced to have fixed the skybolt, that through the recompaction of the Roman Imperium they had restored the golden age, and this all had to be founded on an origin that, as you understood, whether you pick the Romulian, say, connection, like at least in the immediate generation before, or the Trojan one, or the archaic Trinity, Capitoline Trinity, you always had a Jovian descent. The Romans, of course, everyone is descends from God, right? Also the animals, the generation of this higher race of divine that eventually, because of the sins of essentially of itself, of mankind as its reflection, its offspring, that already evidently derives from some issue that had happened, had constantly sort of fallen. And so what the Romans had been doing with the civil wars was recompacting the sin of the greatest of heroes, that, as you know, in all Indo-European tradition and beyond, are the ones that are always more challenged, right? And we will see it now, because the same Romulian story is about this. It's about the greatest sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of your own alter ego, right? That's what Remus is, the losing side of yourself, the darker nature of yourself. And so if you're able to slay that, to sacrifice essentially yourself as in a mirror, you are only able to found the race of conquerors that will take over the world. And Rome had taken over the world, right? This is the incredibly important point here. And that's something that, again, until the 19th century was actually believed to be the entire deal, while only one empire could exist, and that was the Roman one, for any other people. You see, this is radical. We explained it many times. The people still believe today, essentially, that wherever they come from has a relevance. Because, of course, they're morally relativistic and they do not have a divine standard, right? There is a history, there is something that happened in the world. If you still haven't understood what the Roman Empire was, or what Christianity was, why they came about in the broader history of mankind and of the fall, it's useless that you study anything in your life, at least, if that's your limit, right? Your ideological allergy to the concept, because you still believe that your fallen nature is relevant, and you don't owe anything to anyone except being a total failure, like as we can appreciate in today's society at every single level. Well, the problem is yours. You will pay for that, right? This awaits you, right? And you will not have an afterlife, because you will disappear. That's the point, right? And only those who achieve, and hardly we can see anything of this today, will enjoy eternal life. And these people were fighting for that to happen, for us, right, to enjoy that as well. And the lack of awareness of this ABC of the pillar of the superiority of Western civilization is the first and foremost sign of moral, cultural, and personal inferiority for every single person in the world. And it goes without saying that I don't know how many 0.00% of the population is even remotely aware of what I'm talking about. But let's skip this aspect. So to go back to the story, as you know, Aeneas had fled the destruction of Troy, right? which also in the concept of self-sacrifice and broader destiny and what this should have molded this hero in the process is something that would have been very clear to a Roman audience at the time. As you know, he would bring on his shoulders his father Anchises, that in his death, making love with Venus herself had generated him. Right? So we're not talking just random people here. Right? One must understand what it means being enamored with a goddess, and being able to procreate with her actually means in a context like, the Bronze Age, and where literally the next raider that would arrive covered in plate armor was actually seen as a demigod, right? So none of this is random. None of this is just a story that was just thrown there to embellish the libri ab urbe condita. So Aeneas, as you know, has a great virtue, that is the pietas, right? Which is a very broad concept, right? We have piety in English and in other languages deriving from the Latin term, but say the Roman virtues cannot be explained, at least simply through our translations, not just because our words literally mean a different thing. They have a different acception. They were molded throughout centuries of decay, but literally because it entailed a wide range of qualities, right? There is also great affection and attachment of Aeneas as a son towards the father, right? Aeneas had been exalted by the same Achaean conquerors, which is yet another concept that goes far beyond the mere recognition of the honor of the arms, but it evidently has, in the context of the greater Trojan War that involved the same gods, as you know, the same forces of the world, like a hell of a destiny and recognition. And we will speak of what this destiny actually was meant to be, because to us destiny is something that is sort of marked, stamped on you, and whatever you do will still happen. These people didn't believe this at all, right? Look at my video about the Sol Invictus, right? And the same concept of thuke in Greek. It was literally the will of the ruler initially, that only later came to be fate, like something that you couldn't change, fix. This passage occurred through human degeneration in basically all the other religions. The Norse believed this, then they lost that, right? By more or less the same age of the Romans and the Greeks, they had already essentially stopped to believe that there could literally be a man that could make it, right, in transfiguring the world. And so this detachment from the sacred was and the point of contact, especially between heaven and earth, is something that was melting away. And in a sense, when Livy was writing, that's exactly what the Roman civil wars had sort of meant, right? Always remember that what Augustus, by his own propaganda, was coming to do was just receiving from Caesar through his self-sacrifice and his coming out of the res publica as an actual hero that sort of came out of the ecumenic power, and so outside of the physical realm, and so just as a divus, in fact, just like Jovilius means Julius. Think about this. That's why Caesar would normally think to descend from gods. This was not propaganda in the pragmatistic, deterministic, materialistic, contemporary sense that you have been told. This was the actual belief of these people. These people were sure since birth of their ancestry. They descended from God, right? Everybody did, and these guys at least had a preferential way that was supported by all these sagas that unfortunately we have lost, but that were literally out there, right? And the fact that they aren't available, but that all the histories are quite clear about these guys believing it, right? Doesn't entitle anyone to think that this was just some sort of strange invention. It's how you connect yourself, even if it had been just a pragmatic thing. How do you present yourself in front of the res publica populi Romani if you come up with this, right? It's just a political standard nobody has. Today, we do not have politicians who say, I'm the son of God. You don't, right? And ask yourself why there aren't, and who we are, unfortunately for us, because of this, and not because of because of all of us, including potential politicians, actual politicians. It's not the usual populistic fourth estate mental deficiency of mocking the political class. It's literally mocking the same lesser people that compose the majority of society. That's the exact problem here. The Roman, of course, were a chosen divine race of conquerors that had accomplished what no other people would, before and after. So all this had to be framed within a concept that would confer to these characters, also in the stories, that the same Livy inserts here, because what do they think, in spite of what he said before about the Trojan cycle, right, as opposed to the Romano-Italic sagas, right? That's why he was not dismissing any of them. He just had to make understand what this ancestry entailed for the Roman people as a whole. This is incredibly important. This was the point. Aeneas had managed to leave Troy with this universal mission. The winds had pushed him, as you know, towards Italy, and making of Latium the true center of this evangelical fulfillment. The Saturnia Tellus was not just a random location, just per se. It messed up with properly the concept of time in this. It was going back even before it was about the chance and I'm talking Fortuna here, mater et filia deorum, and what Saturn had embodied also relatively to Jupiter, and so the foundations of the universe, right, as a pillar itself. Everything can fail, right, and the Clausewitzian nature of Roman culture was literally drinking from this blood. The idea that you could not achieve anything if you were not able to put a stake yourself, and all what the world meant. That's how much of a power the Romans had to wield, right? And this is the story from a son of Aeneas, the gens Julia, the gens Jovilia, the gens of God, the clan of God, the one of Julius Caesar and of Augustus, the stock of the Imperial dynasty. So here we're talking something that, as you know, in Livy times, Imperial dynasty is not the sort of sclerotized, just some people more or less deterministically, chosen among a pool just while somebody else was governing in their stead, as many times in history would happen, or something that would sort of fail in the accomplishment. We're talking about the actual stock that had allowed the imperium to transfigure the world. So Livy, writing in Augustan times, had obviously, it was making reference to this and obviously having to explain this and how it had come to be, right? So, you know the story again. Aeneas marries Lavinia, the daughter of the Latin king Latinus, and he founded Lavinium, where the Trojan exiles settle themselves for good, right? They put an end to this Mediterranean pilgrimage, this other Odyssey, fundamentally, albeit a much more, fixed one, right? The Odyssey, as you know, of course, today we're not talking about the origins of the Aeneid specifically, but you know that the Iliad is much more, psychopathically, exploding in blood from every sort of possible Indo-European warrioristic sense. The Odyssey instead is a sort of pelagic, already softer, feminine-dominated. It's Ulysses is quite the guy, etc., but it belongs, in fact, to two different eras. As you know, we don't think that this was composed by the same guy. The figure of Homer is somehow mythical in itself, but this is not much important. Aeneas is the guy that, in this sense, has a destiny to fulfill. The destiny of the world. Rome, still to this day, nobody has ever re-achieved that after Rome. Right? And then these guys blend in with the Latins from Aeneas and perhaps from Lavinium. Ascanius is born, and he founds a new city on the Albanian hills that is called, famously enough, Alba Longa, a name that fundamentally stems etymologically from the fact that that the settlement elongates itself over the dorsal of the Alban mountain, and you know that this was the seat of the most sacred of the Latin sanctuaries, right? And that was, in fact, the one under which the edges of which Rome really emerged as well. So this represented sacrality par excellence. This was the capital of, it was not really a capital, but it was the main center of Latium, right? And we are pretty sure that Alba Longa did rule over early Rome. Again, today I'm not going to talk archaeology or say where Rome was, but maybe just at the end, where Rome was sort of in terms of political development in these times, but maybe just at the end we will refer to the, of course, very ancient, several millennia old settlement in Rome, obviously enough. We're not talking about the foundation of Rome in a historical sense, but the myth is more important than history. So here, there's all the story. It's difficult for me to simply summarize, but let's say after various generations of kings, the one Proca leaves the regnum, and let's remember how sacral monarchy worked among the Indo-Europeans. Again, you have the video about the Sol Invictus, but it's important to stress that the coming back of the monarchy in Augustan times was meant to bring back that royal sacrality, inverting the fall of man, and so bringing back together with the, as you know, those powers that had been in fact distributed among the various Roman magistracies, and that had, after the fall of kings, in fact passed in the hands of the oligarchy, now was essentially coming back. For example, the Pontifex Maximus, that was literally the guy that was a prerogative, the one of building bridges of these sacred kings, that as such would literally bridge humanity with God, and that were in sort of another space between the same world of the gods and the world of men, right? Because they were struggling in the process. Again, well, this is all explained in the video about the Sol Invictus. It's a much more non-intuitive thing than we think, and that a bit like Caesar, as we were saying before, from the theology of his fortuna, his personal fortuna, had come out of the Res Publica. You see how everything really matches, right? The Romans never say this explicitly, but every single of these explanations actually fits the broader picture. I've been studying this for some year now, and it's one of the most mind-blowing aspects of this all. But this is a stock of kings. This is why it's so important. right? Because boasting an ancestry from these guys means to be actually those who can come to be monarchs again of the entire world, given that Rome had conquered the latter now, right? So everything was augmenting in that, and so the idea of the monarchy rebirthing again the fall of mankind and representing the golden age it's all about the Augustan policy, as you know. And Livy here was aware of that as well and had to provide with that explanation. If you read Virgil, like today we'll not talk about Virgil, but I don't know, read the chapter in which Aeneas kills Turnus. There is there the same concept of the Imperium and Fortuna and victory that were literally appearing on the battlefield. I mean, it's really that mind-blowing, right? But as we were saying, King Procca leaves his reign to his firstborn Numitor, that, as you understand, there has from the numen, right, this sort of very other complex concept, but say of a power that acts, right, in the world, and that with the proper pietas as well, you can summon and handle and sort of replicate it. If you wonder why sacrifices and rituals were so important, why in Libyan times the Romans had still their own archaic Roman religion that had nothing to do with the concept that we think again of the copy of the Greeks, but they didn't quite understand it, at least in say explicit rational sense, but they still carried that out. It's because they knew that the spell was there, that the power was to be handled in that fashion. That's why this tradition had to be reinforced through these legions as well, because this was actual sacred knowledge, right, that every Roman should have known in the first place, in spite of the generation of times that had brought to the bloodshed between the same Romans, and that in fact Romulus' story had to sort of fix once again. And in fact here we find the first issues within that race of gods that was so perfect, descended from Aeneas, this great hero, descending from Jupiter and so on, in a preferential, faster way, let's say, than other people that had instead degenerated further, that were not like him, a great ruler and dynast. So the second-born son of Procca overthrows his brother Numitor, and he kills his male nephews, obliging the niece Rhea Sylvia, which has also a very interesting etymology, because she embodies a bit that sort of absolute feminine concept of also of the chthonic dimension, whose etymology is crystalline, right? Rhea means earth, and Sylvia has to do with the forest, the world. So it's a deeply chthonic meaning. But she was, as you know, a Vestal virgin, right? These women were devoted to perpetual virginity because they had to embody again the absolute perfection of the feminine principle bent to male full order, right? And that yet was so powerful in that sense, and bearing, however, the sacred fire that, as you know, in the Vestal virgins were probably the ones that had to maintain the sacred Indo-European fire. This tells you, it's just like, as you know, Agnes and Ignis from Vedic to Latin. It's the same concept, except in Roman culture, the importance of the transfigurational need of the chthonic element to be subordinated brutally, right, to male order, had brought these women to, again, acquire such importance symbolically in this passage to be entrusted with sacred fire, with this enormous risk, but again, no risk, no reward, right? The Vestal virgins in this sense were of enormous relevance. Of course, if they had let the sacred fire going off just for a minute, they would have as you know, being buried alive, to be destined to the most chthonic nature of themselves that had prevailed in the feminine, chthonic, sinful dimension. And so what happens with her, right? She's actually of very noble blood, so she's not really the son of the earth, of the communistic, feminine sort of pre-Indo-European order that had disordered, that had thrown the world into chaos. She has this interesting blend, and as you know, that blend is always the one that makes the most interesting things. And as you know, that criminal sin of giving up her virginity occurs, but in a fatal way, because of course she is raped by Mars himself. And so her, you can't say that her sin actually is fully happening, because in the moment in which it happens, it's immediately producing the conception of a new order in Romulus and Remus, because it's Mars that has even, of course, more strong. He's the great hero here, right? It's not the Ares of the Greek mythology that is always scorned and whatever. He's the actual and terrible, heroic, militaristic, and extremely rigidly patriarchal order that reaffirms himself into her, and as such, she bears the fruit of this of this union. In this very perilous moment, by the way, in which the same male order had messed itself up, because Numitor was actually the legitimate heir, whereas Amulius wasn't. He sheds his brother's blood. In his the one of his son, and he wants to kill basically everyone. So there is almost again, this is all the same story in the myth. These children that are the blood that should have been extirpated actually make it through against any odd, right? And in fact, Livy writes beautifully, but I have reason to believe that the origin of such a great city, of Rome, was wanted by fate, that in this sense is the will, right, in many ways, of all these illustrious elements. The most prestigious empire that has ever existed had to be born second only to the power of the gods, right? And here again, the latter aspect is actually Livy as a Roman does elevate Rome actually to the same level with this phrase alone, but it says second, right, as if still this was a human business that of course could re-elevate to the divine level, but he had seen the civil wars. His native Padua had been, I made a video about medieval Padua, by the way, had literally witnessed how low humanity could fall, how much blood could be shed, how much of this is permeated with sin still, right? So even if Rome is better than any other, there is still evil in this humanity, right? And that must be pointed out, because the divine power here is something above, is something ideal, if you want. It is the truth, it's God, right? So here is the story. Rhea Sylvia suffered a violence, after which she bore 2 twins, and she proclaimed that this is also important, that she actually has a voice in this, that Mars was the father of that illegitimate offspring, right? And this could be accepted only if Mars himself had been. Otherwise, this would have been just basically, it's better if I don't say what, but, it would have been really against the same divine law. But here it's the divine that takes over itself and breaks the law. You see how it happens. This is just how Caesar had gone out of the res publica to fix it, because he only could, right? And Livy here introduces still that sort of the criticism says, just anecdotally, perhaps she was truly convinced of this. Perhaps she thought that attributing the paternity to a god would justify the sin. But, and this is where Livy is enormous, says certainly there weren't divinity or man, deities or men capable to preserve her and her sons from the cruelty of the kings. Meaning what? Right? That she actually, that the thing is actually messed up. The priestess is imprisoned and brought in chain. Amulius ordered eventually that the two children were thrown in the current of the river, and for a providential case, right? But remember what providentia actually means in Latin, right? It's the capacity also of the Sol Invictus to be able, it's like the eye of Ra, that whatever is seen, say whatever you think, and the eye opens, will be transformed into reality. And this is just divine will, right? And so for this it happened. So here there is a broader deity that is intervening in this quite tormented story, and this sort of upside down world, for which still it's like the light that is not overshadowed after all. The Tiber had swollen and it had formed certain large ponds, so it was not possible to reach the normal course of the current. Those who executed the order of essentially drowning the children or entrusting them to the waters had, however, in fact, found it probability that the children would drown in spite of the stagnating waters. So in other words, they were told to bring them into the actual riverbed, and instead it was swamped all around, and they just leave them there. And so, convinced to execute at best the task received by the king, they exposed the children in the most easily reachable pond, that is exactly in the place known as Romularis, in which today we have the Ficus Ruminalis. This is a bit like the Yggdrasil, right? These are the pillars of the world, because this is exactly where Rome is going to be established, right? And this tree is sacred, in fact, and Livy, points out that it was there in his time, and he explains at the time those were all abandoned, uninhabited places. And here, of course, he's the one who's not right, because, of course, we know that Rome was actually inhabited from quite a long time, the late Ice Age, and at least the place where Rome would be built eventually. And Livy says, still today, we believe that the low water level abandoned on a shallow, the basket in which the children had been exposed, and that had been floating on the current, on the river, and a she-wolf, a thirsty she-wolf, arrived from the nearby hills towards the place from which a cry was come from the children. This is beautiful. This is one of the most. If you just conceive in this phrase, what Livy really envisages, right? The fact that here you can see literally the warbanders still keeping to extol this youth, right? To bring them to nurture themselves. This is the same Mars, right? Remember what the brotherhoods of Roman warriors swore to, right? They were brothers in Mars. They belonged to the deity. And of course the she-wolf gives the soma, the milk, to the children, of course nurturing them into into that warriorhood, right? And she comes from the hills, closer to God, to the shallow waters. He picks them up. You see, he this is the up and down, the water, the tectonic chaos here is ordered by the martial omen that first ingravitates Rhea Sylvia, then saves its offspring through the she-wolf, right? And more, because there is a background here that is quite relevant. It builds up the entire Roman identity. Of course, the she-wolf went down and she offered the two children her breasts with such tenderness, right? So this is a miracle in many ways, because of course the wolf is, the wolf is not such a dangerous animal as one thing, but the identity, like it's zoologically speaking, but the identity here is, here the forces of nature, the fiercest ones bend to the sacred offspring of God, right? It's such tenderness prompts a shepherd that was keeping his sheep, so those that the wolf would eat, and that belonged, by the way, the sheep to the king, right? And his name, Livy says, we still remember, Faustulus, right? Faust as a name etymologically comes from Latin, means it's like the fastest. It's fast means it is illicit. It is positive. It is the moment in which you can and must act, right? So this is an augural, a positive figure, right? He's a shepherd, right? He really belongs to that early stock breed of Latin, again, populations that was part of also this war banding, warrior raids, cattle raiding, and so on, and it represents unity, because the war bander, basically, here that would steal, kill the cattle and so on, here comes together with the shepherd, and it represents the unity that this offspring brings, right? And Faustulus finds the she-wolf licking the two twins. So the shepherd takes the twins and brings them to the stables where his wife, Larentia, would have brought them up, right? Larentia, etymology, the same one of laurel, the laurel wreath, right? That in Roman religion represented archaically the spirit of the household, this power that lays within the same fireplace, the same sacred fire, the same. She is the one who keeps the house, who rises the new generation of warriors that are son of the wolf, and in the sense of the shepherd and of his wife. And so here you have all together, right, the Mars, right, the Quirites, and Romulus essentially as the new Jupiter rather than Mars, right? Because of course in Romanity, Jupiter would be the actual goal that is above Mars, right? Rome is all about the Jovian theology. Mars is the still wild, brutal, barbaric, Romano-Italic, Indo-European background that, however, is elevated to the highest, right, of heaven through these constant fights that we will see now. And even these poor individuals cooperate, right, to raise the children and to grant them, together with the wolf, their destiny to be fulfilled, but through their own biological witness, through the fact that they were part of this original stock, and that was capable of bringing together, reuniting, bringing back to the one, bringing back to God, just like the Roman Empire was meant to do, right? So this is not a story, right? You read Livy, and you have this fully understood, And it's obvious that he knew that, right? And that, however, he doesn't say that, because maybe he had not rationalized itself. Maybe he thought that certain aspects were sort of, we have to be sure about the info that we get, because it's a big deal getting it right or not as a historian, but also as a Roman in this context, and thinking about what we must be as Romans. But he would have not written these things if they had not made the sense that we're illustrating here. So Livy goes on here. I'm skipping also certain passages, so there is all the history of Romulus, Remus, etc. Paragraph more, paragraph less. He says, tradition wants that Remus, this is the famous foundation of Rome, right? So first 6 vultures. They're a bit like the eagles, actually. When already the augural vision had been announced, this is the vision, it's like the Providentia, is understanding where the vultures would fly so that the new city could be founded. Romulus saw a double number of them. What does this mean? Right? It means the Latins would have said ubi maior minor cessat, right? It's about coming back to one. It's about the universal mission. If you love God, you cannot be satisfied with less, right? You cannot place above even the sacral rituals, still, however, ordained by man, when God shows you that this is wrong, this is less, that this is not as much as you can be. Otherwise, it would have not made sense for Romulus to eventually, as you know, even today we do not arrive there, but he transfigured, right? He apotheosized, say, and this was meant, of course, in an absolute way. This was not just Mars, it was Jupiter himself, and that's the authority with which he founded Rome, right? And here it's interesting that the retinues of both twins basically elected their own respective chiefs as kings, both of them. So that's why, and this is against the order. This is just like the civil wars that had already happened, had just happened in Livy's time, right? They could not attribute the right to rule to both of them. There's only one truth, right? So one must be wrong by definition, always. This is true at every level, right? Some people have been raised with this concept that nobody knows what the truth is, so let's stop searching and pretend that there is no rule. What the hell does it mean? Like, it's not because the truth is easy to find. Nobody really can fully reach that unless you transfigure like Romulus. But this is the point of the story. That doesn't mean that you have to stop searching, or that when you have two different opinions, one is worth like another. One is always worse than the other, and the other is always superior to it, and it has more right to exist than the other. Right? In this case, the retinues, Livy says, attributed the right to, the Remus retinue attributed to Remus the right to rule for having seen the birds first, notoriously in the story, and Romulus for having seen more of them. Right? This is also interesting because it messes up with the concept of formality and substance as well. The manifestation of the mind power is something continuous, right? You can't quite say, well, I stop here because God wanted it. If next second you lower the guard, you're done for. And of course, Romulus was right. Right? For this, a brawl occurred, and under the push of ire, blood was shed. Right? These two retinues, these two gangs were beating the hell out of each other, but very realistically for the times in which Romulus would have been around, and struck to death in the fray, Remus fell. Right? It's, however, more spread, Livy says, the legend according to which Remus, in sign of mockery towards the brother, had jumped across the piercing the pomerium that Romulus had traced. As you know, it was a quite sacred limit because the impurity could not exist within it, notoriously. That was sort of heavenly. It was the heavenly city. It was the herbs, right? So nobody could mess up with that. Of course, easily the life of a brother is less important than the truth and God, right? And this is actually the point we will explain now of the story. Romulus, so angered, would have killed Remus and told him, shouting, "May the same fate suffer he who has to cross my walls," Jupiter's walls. And Romulus detained thus alone the command, and he gave his name to the city that had been founded. Now, according to tradition, again, you cannot basically transfigure unless you shed blood. This is fundamental. I made a video about the way of the where the fire of death blazes, or the way of the left hand, right? The perfect blend between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. You cannot essentially have the Apollonian and pure perfection if you do not master the Dionysian, if you don't summon it, if you don't fight, if you don't shed blood, if you are not able to sacrifice the best part of yourself, if you don't have enough faith to think that God will give you that power, basically, if you don't nullify yourself in it intentionally, right? If you don't do that, you will never achieve it, right? And so here, Remus, of course, represents the alter ego of Romulus, and Romulus must kill essentially himself in the process. This is a bit like Woden that acquires the wisdom, right, of the runes through his own hanging, right? Here Romulus doesn't quite do it explicitly. It's a context evidently that shows how these men were alike, and the fact of the twins is a very clever way of expressing the same concept, because it expresses also the rivalry and the evil, right, that exists within all of us, right, between all of us. And Romulus manages to overcome that, right, in the name of a higher principle, the only divine one possible. And there is, I have to make more research on this, but I think there is early symbolism in Roman, in the representation of the twins and the wolf, also of a little deer, that represents, as you know, in the Indo-European mythology, the noble victim, right? This is also a symbol of Christ, right? A royal victim, actually. That is essentially representing the spolia opima, essentially the human sacrifice that was necessary to be made in order to prove God that you had been able to kill the finest of your enemies and the purest of blood, so that in other words you were purer through judicial combat than the purest of the bloods, and that as such you would have essentially been able to reach the highest spiritual level, the one of divinity, technically. So Remus was of the same blood of Romulus, identical in all the nobility, but Romulus manages to, in fact, self-sacrifice. Here the fact that Livy points out that there is a more widespread theory, that doesn't mean that it's more widespread tale about why Romulus killed Remus, doesn't mean that these weren't intertwined, but he is a bit more, let's say, he has a slightly more contempt towards it, because it's as if people had preferentially used the story to make of Remus simply a foolish guy, right? The story, the more famous one, sort of comes off as this, that Remus was just a jealous brat or whatever, and this was not the case. Remus was yet another hero, right? But in this way, the popular story was catchier than the story of the vultures, right? Even though probably they were all together when in the ancestral sagas, right? But in Livy's times, they had been readapted in such a fashion, so that he at least makes the split. But the most important thing is that Romulus, just like Augustus, reunites the system. Naturally, the fact that Augustus was not he by blood he was also a Julian, right? But he was also transfigured in the moment in which he had been adopted by Caesar. So there is always, remember, this sort of capacity of change, of transfiguring everything that becomes, that is under your rule. This is fundamental for the Romans because it gives that force, right, to elevate yourself above who you think you could be. And here Romulus understands that. You didn't think you could be. Romulus understands that Remus remains to a lower standard, right? And consider that these guys, again, had been conceived out of a rape, right? And so it doesn't matter how much divine and fatal and, of course, in that sense, legitimate in nature this was, they were, in a sense, cursed. I mean, this could be a curse as much as the literal salvation that only Romulus, however, would achieve while Remus was killed. So this duality is very important in the story for the aforementioned reasons, right? For especially the necessity of seeing that you can do without the worst part of yourself and literally aim at the very top of whom you can be. And Livy goes on in the following paragraph. The last one was the 7th. This one is the 8th. It says, accomplished thus according to rite the ceremonies and gathered people in assembly, Romulus dictated the foundations of law, because only the laws allow a people to become unique and compact, right? A unique and compact organism. This is crucial as well. This is divine law, as a matter of fact. This is the law of Rome. This is the law of the people that will take over the world entire, and that did. Right? So this is not just some strange law. This is sacred, divine law. It's the same one for which you could not do anything against Rome without massacring the person who did so. And remember Mars Ultor, right? In Romanity, and what this special exception of Mars as the Avenger really meant. This had a very important role in the Roman military, in fact, in the official religion of the Roman army. I made a video about that years ago. So the purpose, Livy says, as Romulus was aware, that the laws would have appeared as unbreakable to those people that were still rough, right? Only if he himself would have made himself worth of veneration thanks to the exterior signs of authority, right? And growing his majesty, wearing in a particular way, and especially bringing, having next to him the 12 lictors. These were the guys with the fasces, right? That were, of course, a symbol of utmost unity. And in this 12 symbolism, that in numerology has to do with that completion, an internal order, and that in fact reflect the same birds that Romulus had spotted. In fact, Livy says some think that he chose that number from the birds that had prophesied his regnum. And Livy says, I don't mind instead to share the opinion of those who think that also those guards derived from the neighboring Etruscans. You know, the story of the Decapolis, right? So the idea that this 12 lictores would have had a connection with those figures. Surely, again, the symbolism was shared in many ways, but that's not the case just per se. It's interesting that Livy just brings up his own idea, and again, he can be wrong without any doubt. And this, I think, like, it can be just a rhetorical expedient, right? He says, I don't mind. I like the concept that, because this was a story that eventually was shared by the Romans, that he, and Livy, by writing this, sort of wants to enter a bit the attitude of how we are Romans, we think these things, right? I like that version, and what do you like instead, right? That's kind of the attitude, at least, that, in my opinion, eventually, I do a bit like Livy, shines through, however, his prose, right? So I would literally stop to this for today, as I'll be commenting something else, because this story stresses, again, divine unity in a way that, again, can't be denied in any theological fashion, right? This is one of the foundations, also the reasons why I say that only one God, of course, existed, and of course that the divine ruler embodied this as well. I will not descend into traditional metaphysics today. I will make other videos explaining exactly what this power consisted of. There are various different layers of this, of how the ruler interacted with divinity. The Romans were particularly attentive and careful about this, and the original meaning of it, that here Livy is recovering, is trying, again, as a Roman in the 1st century BC, to be in the mind of archaic Rome, because that was not that far compared to other stories. I mean, the Greeks took had a much longer time of cultural mediation. The Romans literally boomed, from a day to another, and so they were much closer to this sort of incredibly powerful awareness of the traditional capacity of acquiring power through virtue, and literally molding the world at their own image. That is the same reason why the Roman Empire existed in the first place, because they truly believed this. I mean, the Roman identity was founded exclusively on the awareness that they were destined to take over the entire universe through to this omen. There is no other explanation to that. You can actually explain Roman history exclusively in this way if you want, right? The rest only follows from it. There aren't any other deterministic idea. These people rejected that wholly, and they succeeded exactly like no other because they believed in this. There's no other people that made of its own identity such traditional theology. And it is really incredible in many ways. Again, there is a series I made about the Roman conquest of Italy, Roman archaic warfare, feudal Rome, that already, explained some of this, but we must forcibly come back on that, probably some history of religion videos to understand it better. But it's self-evident to a microscopic degree. And there is no doubt, also in Livy's view, that after a bloody civil war, like the one between Romulus and Remus, and in the ones of the 1st century BC, only divine law can bring this to an end. The dura lex sed lex. Doesn't matter how harsh law is. This is a radically correct civilizational principle. If you make law something humanly made, it's nothing. There can't be order. This is what the myth here tells. It's what God says. It's not what humans say. And only he who is the medium of God can dictate that. Right? And this law is above anyone else. Right? There cannot be a civilization within the ruthless effectiveness of this law. Otherwise, you have the system falling apart. You have these war bands killing each other. You have the res publica broken, and brothers killing each other. Right? But there is a sin behind that. Right? Augustus himself had actually made it clear that the Sibylline books had been violated, and that was the sin that had brought the chosen people of Rome to break Because if the Romans were that people and they were convinced of that, like how could a civil war even happen? And of course, Caesar had fixed that and entrusted it to Octavian. So the Romans have conquered the Mediterranean for their military superiority. But the imperial power does not exclude that Rome was born from this fratricide as well. After all, that Rome keeps expanding further, right? So again, the necessity of the nobiliar, brotherly self-sacrifice is clearly outlined also in this, right? Law must be reimposed because the law is God. So if somebody fights, of course there is a sin, like it's not just you have to shed blood every time you need to do something. Well, in theory it is, but only if you're less than God, right? Because otherwise God is perfect, you do not need anything, right? Everything is represented to God. But if you want to re-augment that, right, you must, of course, win a resistance within yourself as well, right? And the story is nice because it talks about the shepherds, the war bands, the chieftains. Again, this is feudal Rome at its best. It's a real thing. In the 4th century BC, the Romans were still fundamentally about this. Only at that time they began to change into something else. There is here some hint of the Etruscan influence, as just Livy talking about the Trojan cycle, of course, hints at the Hellenic one. But the important thing is for Livy, glorifying the past entails the necessity of this brutality. As a Roman, he's quite aware that this makes an example of it all, and that the drama, the tension, the tragedy is the embellishment of the story. It's a positive thing. It's how it must be, right? So Livy accepts the legend and attempts a rationalization of the same, which is essentially what we do in history as well, right? There is nothing here that does not work, right? There may be different versions. Livy writes to a world that, as we've seen here, for example, the same Greece is under Rome, right? What he writes will be, in fact, one of the most important historical works in the history of mankind that we still all study and read and learn from. So he must appear, at least canonically, cautious and opening to different interpretations at time, but always giving you that note that he himself, we are at some level with Livy in the interpretation of the older sagas, right? With the exception again that Livy was much closer to the actual meaning, the culture. He actually access to oral and written tradition that we don't, but we also have, say, more elaborated knowledge. Livy did not have all the archaeological evidence, all the things, but he, of course, could and would read this material, listen to it, and would understand much better than we can ever dream to do, essentially, this reality, whenever it would have happened. I mean, the Baronian date is just, something, but this was part of values that were actually much fresher, recent. Also in the Roman culture, the same 1st century BC than we usually think, right? Livy was a man of letter. He came from a certain background. Again, he adapts a bit to a more modern and secular stream for literary purpose, but he actually is soaked into that as well. He knows that, and we don't. So that's the effort that you must make in the 21st century to understand not just, of course, something happening in the 8th century BC allegedly, but also in the 1st century BC as well, that is that far, considered that chronologically, and without the means of data preservation that we had today in the last 800 years of our history. right? So what is crucial here is that Rome was founded according to a precise sacred ritual. The Urbs was born, and with that, the model of divine perfection on earth. And it turns out that actually the rise, the foundation of Rome, etc., is not that distant after all. It's not just a little story, right? Compared to what we see here. Everybody knows about this legion and so on, but the deeper meanings, aside from what I can do with this video, is just very, very, interactory. It doesn't really tell anything special aside from this sort of this easier, traditional religious interpretation. But as you know, this time in history is still studied enormously. Like in the last decades, there's plenty of stuff written on this, and archaeology helped as well. So it's history of religion, it's anthropology, it's lots of things cooperating, right? We will see how the Roman territory was born in many ways. We will look at the actual geology as well, the various ages, right? The various. There is all in the surroundings of Rome a very specific terrain. There is a very specific sense even of what the Romans could perceive about these incredibly old movements, and how this divine forces would agitate from the bowels of the same earth as much as they later on, but of course as Latins, as Italics that had come during the Indo-European invasions and had taken over the peoples who were there, that embodied always that sort of contrast between the heavenly conqueror and the chthonic subject, right? And this is still alive in the patricians and the plebeians. We made some videos explaining the same colors involved in this, in a genetic sense. The Romans still portray that. That's the fascinating thing, not a racialistic myth devoid of foundation. But surely Livy's history opens to so many different, let's say, insight that for today's video, like, just leave here, given that, again, it's better to go step by step. There's just like one little note, nothing special, but about an excavation at a Roman technical institution known as Severi, in a place called Torre Spaccata, which means broken tower. Because this institute was being built in such locality, and actually at a relatively small depth underground during this works, an inhabited area of roughly 6,000 years ago came to light. Just to tell you how old actual Rome is, at least as in its population history, and this of course dates back even before that. Of course that was not Rome, but there is all a history behind that, and a history that would be interesting to think from the perspective of those who believed how these people could have fallen from heaven such a long time ago, given that there were different layers there of human decay, and even evolution could be explained in the inverted sense. That is to say that there's not been much of an evolution, but actually an involution, and that these pre-existing inhabitants were sort of the ones who fell from the highest places and to the lowest grounds, and then gradually the same heavenly stock sort of degraded itself to appear like I know I'm saying something scary, but we'll get to that, I promise. And but to a strictly archaeological level, we can appreciate how, for example, certain little blocks of lava and certain levels of cooked clay were found, we find some rare bones of sheep and goat, certain stone items, certain blades, arrowheads, certain instruments to scratch. Right, we're talking about 5000 BC. Right, and the people who lived in Torres Pacata 6,000 years ago were agriculturers and cattle breeders. They were obviously extremely primitive. There is no doubt that their same techniques. Land exploitation was very, very simple. They would integrate the production of an agriculture activity with meat that they would hunt. There was an aristocracy that would practice that, but just a community very involved. Again, we're talking about times that I normally don't venture, and I will also explain at some point why, as a military historian, it's better sometimes to leave it on that, because it's one of those fields in which really there's so few that it becomes more like an ideological struggle as opposed to research evidence. I'm much happier to be a medievalist than I don't even know. This is it's a very old interest. Like these ancient peoples of the Roman territory did not know metals. They had a right essentially to the maximum limit of the resources exploitation of nature, with the use of instruments essentially deriving only from the work of stone. Even when this was very refined, right? But again, this is not my territory. I will just give it to you to, think how times change and how the world grows after all, and what kind of interpretation you can give to that, considering the explanations of divine nature, which is essentially what Livy cares about, as you can see, right? That's what I want to leave you with, because it sort of paves the way for an important step that the channel has to take, and that still we haven't fully appreciated, but that I think is also a logical consequence of certain things that we have already brought on the fore. For today, however, I stop it here. We will keep talking about the origins of Rome. For today, however, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.